The way I start laying out my palette, I wanted to show you first of all about the one of the great characteristics of gouache is this is my last gouache uh, palette that I used to do a gouache painting with. The paint is dry and set up, and if I wanted to go back in and retouch or add colors to that existing painting, I could just go and wet a brush and I can reactivate this paint. And so it's kind of a nice bridge between acrylic paint and oil paint. So you can reactivate so that once dry paint that was been used on my palette was dry and set up, then I just wet my brush and reactivate it. Now I can go in and do some painting and have fun reactivating all these different colors that were once dry. So that should be a really fun adaptation or introduction to gouache for you to enjoy and have fun with. So that's what gouache can do for you. Uh, Obviously, this little demo that I'm playing around with right now is just for fun, but it's also wet into wet, so the colors and everything is while the gouache is still wet. Now, once this dries, I could come back in and paint dry over the wet. I don't think I have any white paint that's dry and set up right now. I'll try to find a nice little light value to put a highlight on that little apple, and doing the best I can with that already existing dry paint. Some down there. But that's what the one of the best advantages of gouache is, that you can reactivate it. Now, the thing that I mentioned earlier is you got to be careful, because now that this painting has been started, it's really thin and kind of transparent color, but I can still, if I'm not careful, I can still reactivate that paint that's on my surface of the painting, and I have to be really careful because it will smear or cause problems. So you have to understand that it's a pro to reactivate gouache, and it is a con. Okay. Now, the one thing that you will notice right there that I'm doing is I'm putting a light value opaque color over the existing transparent color. So one thing that I wanted to mention during this little practice demo is that the very best, those same principles that we learned in acrylic, the back to front, the dark to light, thin to thick, large to small, desaturated to saturated, still remain intact for gouache. But the most important principle for gouache is the thin to thick. So if you lay down a really thin transparent layer of paint, that's the way you should start, and then build up opacity and thickness on top of it, because of the reactivating characteristic of gouache. So if you start out with really thick impasto gouache paint and then you try to put layers on top of it, that thick layer that you originally put down will reactivate, and it will become muddy with the other colors or layers that you put down on top of it. So the thin to thick principle is very, very, very important with gouache. All right, so just getting more, building that highlight up on that little apple object just a little bit stronger. Reach up there and grab some of that green color. Now this palette that I'm using just for this demo purpose is has no wet original paint. This is all just used up paint from the last painting that I did. So I'm going to throw on a little leaf there for my apple. But if I was using wet paint right out of the tube, then I could get a lot more opaque and I could get a lot more fun with the original wet paint. But I'm just demoing right now that I can reactivate all this used up paint. So there's my demo for the reactivation part of this wonderful medium gouache. All right, so with that in mind, now I'm going to clean my palette so I can put fresh paint down and then use fresh paint to do another painting. So I'll just dip my paper towel into the water and then I will just clean that existing paint off of my palette so that I can have a nice fresh palette. Now, you can use disposable palette paper like you do in oil paint or in acrylic, but for some reason, the way I feel about these porcelain butcher trays is the gouache feels a little bit more natural when I'm mixing on this porcelain butcher tray, and I don't have to. You've just noticed that I cleaned my palette in about 30 seconds and it's ready to go. Just make sure all of that existing color is cleaned off of there, and in about 30 seconds I can clean my palette and be ready to roll. So that's what I wanted to demo there. Okay, all right, so I'll set up my palette just like I normally would with acrylic. I will take a piece of paper towel, I'll roll it up just like I would to create a wet surface. Dip it into the bucket of water, then I'll squeegee it out with my fingers to get a lot of that water out of there. So it's just basically a really damp watered paper towel now. I'll lay it down just like I would for acrylic. Do a small one down the other side. Now gouache, one of the other disadvantages of gouache is that it's expensive. A little teeny tube of gouache can be up to $10. Sometimes even more expensive than that. And it just is kind of hard to spend that much money on a little teeny tube of paint. And so what I try to be as economical as I can when I'm putting out my colors. So sometimes I'll try to figure out the palette or the colors that I'm going to use, and then if I'm not going to use reds or blues or whatever, I won't even put them out on my palette until I need to, because if I put a color out and then I don't use it and it dries up, yes, I can reactivate it. I can put it into like a film canister and put water into it and mix it up, and it starts to become liquid again. But I try to think a little bit more economically than that, and I just don't put color out unless I absolutely need to, and then we go from there. So there's my palettes ready to put paint on. I will now start to put my gouache out, and I do it in the exact same manner as I would my oil paint or my acrylic paint. So I would start with white, up at the top, and I usually use a lot of white, and so I will put a quite a bit larger amount of white up on the paper towel than I would any of the other colors. There's a little bit of yellow. And for the most part, I keep pretty general with my palette, with my gouache palette. It doesn't come with as many colors as acrylics or oils. So basically the primaries and the secondaries, I'm just putting these colors out. I don't know if I'll use all of these colors in my green apple demo, but I just want to put them out for a demo purpose. Okay, so right now you have white, spectrum yellow, spectrum red, alizarin crimson, and then burnt sienna. Those are about all of the warm colors that I'm going to put out. It's a green apple demo today, and so I'm going to be pretty limited palette, and so I don't know if I'll even use a lot of those warm colors. I'll probably go a little bit more on the cool side. So this is a neutral gray that will, if I need to neutralize or desaturate some of my colors, I'll use that neutral gray that I just put out on my palette. Then I'll go to my cools. So this is primary blue. The one thing that I mentioned in my earlier demo about the introduction of gouache is if you can, I'm going to try to push that up there. It says these are Winsor Newton gouache, and right below that you see the word designer. So that's designer's color, designer's gouache. So Winsor Newton has maintained that original title, or that original concept for gouache. It's designer's gouache because it dries so flat. So there's primary blue, there's ultramarine blue, here's a sap green, and notice that I'm putting out small amounts of color. Gouache goes a long ways, especially if you treat it like traditional watercolor. It will, if you really understand that awesome principle of thin to thick, then you're going to probably start out, for the most part, really thin washes. And so that's why the gouache goes a long ways, is because you really dilute it down and understand that concept of thin to thick. All right. So the best way that I could explain, there's a spectrum violet, or a really beautiful blue, purple color, blue violet, or purple. That might be the equivalent of dioxazine purple in oil paint and acrylic. All the other colors are pretty standard. So there's my palette. Now I'm ready to start mixing paint and start creating a gouache painting.